Hi, everyone. This is Priya Natarajan, the current director of the Frankie program in Science and the Humanities at Yale. I'm absolutely delighted to invite you all to our convening and distinguished speaker series today. And the title of the talk today is A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. But before I tell you about our distinguished guests, let me start by thanking our benefactors, Richard and Barbara Frankie, for their generosity in funding this program that enables all the exciting activities that we are able to do. And I'm really grateful that we have our activities are such up in such a format that in this moment of pandemic disarray, we are able to continue. And I'm very sorry that we are not able to offer the wonderful receptions, in-person receptions, the food and drink that go with this, the celebratory atmosphere. But however, we are going to make do with intellectual excitement and so first I need to all of you who are assembled that we are recording this event and that all participants must therefore mute their videos, because then we would have to get individual permissions and so on. So kindly mute your videos. If you wish, you could submit talks through the chat feature. This is the process we followed previously. And Ty will help us moderate this. And thank you so much, Ty, for doing that. So our speaker today, I'm thrilled to introduce one of our own distinguished faculty members, Professor Dan Esty. Dan Esty is the Hillhouse Professor at Yale University with primary appointments at Yale's Environmental and Law Schools and a secondary appointment at the Yale School of Management. He currently serves as the director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, co-director of the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. Current research and writing offer cutting-edge thinking about climate change, sustainable investing, innovation, and the energy environment in the energy environment context, and of course matters of corporate sustainability and brand new approaches, radical new approaches to environmental protection. He's a pioneering thinker in helping us reshape how we should think about climate change and how to alleviate it. He's the author and editor of 12 books and dozens of articles on environmental protection, regulatory reform, energy policy, and sustainability metrics, and their connections to corporate strategy competitiveness. So very much rooted in the policy and the real world. He had he's had many prize-winning books. His latest book, a 2019 book, in which he has edited a wonderful set of essays, and I would like to highly recommend that. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and Dan just mentioned that it's just come out in paperback. So I really urge you all to buy it and read it. So this book was just awarded the Financial FT Book of the Year Award, and his previous prize-winning volume was Green to Gold, How Smart Companies Use Environmental Strategy to Innovate, Create Value, and Build Competitive Advantage. And this has recently been named one of the top green business books of the past decade. And he has had many interesting articles. I would like to point one out that I think was particularly impactful for me: Red Lights to Green Lights, from 20th Century Environmental Regulation to 21st Century Sustainability. So I wanted to say a little bit about his career trajectory only because of how distinguished it is and how varied it is, and it gives you a sense of someone who really crosses disciplinary boundaries. That is a hallmark of what we celebrate at the Frankie program. From 2011 to 2014, Professor Esty served as Commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, where he earned a reputation for fresh thinking and practical results. His policy innovations, he launched many policy innovations, include the launch of Connecticut's first in the nation green bank to promote clean energy using limited public funding to leverage private capital, and the lean restructuring of all of Connecticut's environmental permitting programs to make the state's regulatory framework lighter, faster, and more efficient, as well as effective. Prior to taking up his professorship at Yale in 1994, he served in a variety of senior positions at the US EPA, where he helped manage the agency's regulatory program. So you can see that he has had enormous impact, both in the policy realm with action, as well as intellectual heft with his ideas. He's also worked as a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., where he did some breakthrough work on links between trade and environmental issues and the broader challenges of globalization. So before we head into today's talk, I just wanted to remind you of two upcoming events, the next two monthly talks. Just want to briefly advertise them. The talk for November is going to be in the Mapping is Knowing series. And for that, the speaker for that, we managed to snag the famous science fiction writer and thinker of the Anthropocene, Kim Stanley Robinson. And our December edition of the Mapping as Knowing talk is going to be given by Frank Snowden, who has worked on epidemics. And so anyway, without further ado, Dan, we are delighted to have you here and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Priya, thank you so very much for having me. And special thanks to Ty Camp, who organized today's program, and to Barbara Franke, who makes this all possible. So I'm grateful. And really thank you to all of you who are taking time out of your busy day to be part of this program today. I'm going to present for a bit, but very much hope to move to a conversation and a back and forth dialogue in the not too far future. So let me start by saying that it's just a great pleasure to have a chance to talk about this Better Planet book, especially in the week that it comes out in paperback. It's I hadn't planned it this way, but it's great timing. And for those who are interested, there is in the chat a brochure with a discount coupon. So if anyone finds themselves motivated to go out and buy the book, Yale University Press will make it worth your while with the coupon. So there are, in fact, I think two of the brochures of the book, one of them has a coupon attached. Now, I want to start by saying that it's actually an incredibly interesting moment, and one might even say a critical moment for the discussion that I want to have about a sustainable future, including climate change, but also addressing a broader set of issues. And I say that not just because we're sitting here on the East Coast, at least some of us, while the West Coast is on fire. California has been burning, but we've also seen hurricanes pile on one on top of another into the Gulf Coast. Both of these elements of climatic danger are, I think, signals, not necessarily of any specific climate change we can link up in a very tight causal connection, but of the kind of world that climate scientists tell us we should anticipate in the years ahead. And I do think the threat of climate change and the broader challenge to sustainability is become more and more evident. It's become a question in our political dialogue. Certainly in the election campaign, these issues are playing a much more prominent role. But I really actually want to say that what's special about the moment, from my point of view, is that we are about to shift gears as a nation. Next month we shift, maybe not on the day after the election, but by the end of November, I'm hopeful that we shift from all politics all the time to questions of policy. And that's where this book really has its place. It is, as you heard, subtitled 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. It is a volume that I edited, but represents 56 different authors in these 40 essays, offering up a range of perspectives from a range of political starting points and a range of underlying disciplines, including some folks who are practitioners and not academics, but all offer interesting perspectives on critical issues and thoughtful, carefully constructed, analytically rigorous pathways forward. And that's what I'm actually very excited to dig into a bit today. The book is, by the way, from Yale University Press, a great partnership with the longtime editor there who's done Science and Environment, Jean Thompson Black. So really just a huge pleasure to have been able to work with her and to bring this volume to publication in record time. And it grows out of an effort that the Environment School, by the way, those who have been following Yale for a long time may not have kept up with the fact that the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies has rebranded itself as of a couple of months ago as the Yale School of the Environment. And the new dean of a few years ago, Indy Burke, launched the school on an effort to rethink its direction and strategic plan. And one of the things that emerged was a commitment to be more of a convening platform, to bring people together to talk about sustainability and how to get to a sustainable future. And this book really grows out of that broader dialogue, the Yale Environmental Dialogue, as we call it, organized by Dean Indy Burke, and now kind of a core part of the school's program. And the book itself offers a range of concepts and principles for thinking about environmental challenges and related clean energy questions, land use issues, natural resource management, so the full spectrum of sustainability issues. It offers frameworks, it looks at technologies, it looks at pathways and strategies. So it really is an interesting compilation of ideas. By the way, it represents a number of authors from within the School of the Environment, others from across the Yale campus more broadly, some number of alums as well, and 3 essays are written by students who were able to win the chance to be in the book based on a very competitive process. So let me offer you some thoughts. And I want to start by saying that the idea of my chapter is that we need to imagine a different way of thinking about the environment in the 21st century from what we did in the 20th century. So that's the core hypothesis I'm introducing, that what we did in the past, particularly as we launched the modern era of environmental protection in the United States in the 1970s and in the 1980s, worked at the time, served the purpose of that era, but is not serving us so well today. And that what we really need is a fresh approach, a new approach that advances our strategy and gives us a more clear path to a sustainable future. My essay in the book is called Red Lights to Green Lights, Toward an Incentive-Oriented Sustainability Strategy, and a greater focus on incentives, on how we change behavior, change company behavior, particularly the big polluting industry behavior, but how we change individual choices and behavior is really, I think, a fundamental issue and of real concern and needs to be a focus in environmental policy. So that's my own essay, but I'm also building on a need for better incentives to engage people in delivering the results we need. More use of information and information technology, which of course wasn't available in the same way in the 20th century when our modern efforts at environmental protection were launched. I also, having spent a lot of time trying to understand what's worked and what hasn't over the last 50 years, believe that we need to put much more focus on investment, how we flow money to solve environmental problems and put us toward a sustainable future. I think we underattended to that problem in the 1970s, 80s. Somehow there was an idea that if the law was framed, the money would follow. Turned out not to be true. I also think there is a need to focus on integration, on a more systems-oriented approach. We might call it a more ecological approach to these problems. And I'm going to dig in on all of this over the course of the next 20 minutes or so as I lay out my argument for why we need a 21st century approach to environmental protection and how this Better Planet book sketches, not only in my essay, but in all the essays, some of the elements of what that might look like. So first of all, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that the 20th century strategy of environmental protection was a failure. Quite to the contrary, we have better quality air, much better quality rivers. For those who pick up the book, you'll see that the introductory chapter, I note that I grew up along the Naugatuck River in northwestern Connecticut, and that river used to flow orange and purple, depending on the colors of the Uniroyal factory that was dumping its waste into the river. The river is much cleaner today. It's swimmable. There's fish in it. So we have made huge progress as a society. But I do think there are important questions about how we continue to make progress and address the residual problems that continue to plague us. And that's where my argument focuses on the need for innovation. My belief is we've gotten a good distance with a certain set of strategies, but to go where we need to go over the coming years, we need new ideas, new approaches, new technologies to be brought into the sustainability world. And my basic claim is that the 20th century approach to environmental protection was largely around telling people, particularly the business world, what not to do. So putting up a red light, a stop sign saying, don't do that, don't pollute, can't go there. And that sort of red light strategy did change behavior in some regards, but it was not very good at getting business to become solutions providers. So we don't have a transformed energy foundation for our society compared to what we thought we might have in the way of transformation over the past 50 years. So I want to argue that we should have, just as we have at any intersection, not just red lights that tell people when to stop, but green lights that tell people when to go. We need the same framework of green lights as a complement to red lights in environmental regulation. And what I mean really is that we need incentives. We need to get people who have the capacity to solve problems to step up to those issues, to become solutions providers. And I think my argument is that we need to really structure incentives to flow society's resources towards those solutions providers, and frankly, to steer money away from companies that are a cause of problems and are not moving us towards a sustainable future. So here's the issues that I see us potentially being able to step up to. First, I think there is a value in making people pay for the harm they cause. So the biggest green light is to have those who are doing things in a clean way, not polluting, not pay. And that's a signal of strong value in the business world. So again, my number one green light is price signals. And that would tell us if you're doing things the right way, you don't pay. If you're a polluter, you're going to pay for every increment of harm you're putting out into society. And this is best done if we switch from the 20th century approach to environmental protection that was largely what we in the business call command and control regulation, largely around government mandates that you can't exceed a certain level of pollution, but everyone was allowed to pollute up to that level for free. My argument is nothing for free anymore. Either you stop your harm, no pollution, in which case you don't have to pay. But if you're continuing to pollute, you're going to pay for every increment of harm up to the limit beyond which it's forbidden. And so that's the core idea of a price signal. By the way, in the Better Planet book, Bill Nordhaus, our Nobel Prize winning economist colleague, lays out the case for price signals as the core of the response to climate change. And I agree. Now, more broadly, my argument is that we should really seek to, and this is the radical part of the agenda, Priya promised that I'm working on some radical ideas. The big one is that we should really be committed to ending what economists would call externalities. Smoke up a smokestack, effluent out a pipeline, any kind of spillover of harm from an industry or from an individual onto society more broadly. So I think every company should pay for its emissions out the smokestack. Every one of us should pay for the car exhaust out the back of our car. And I think it was not possible to do this in the 20th century because it was much too complicated to keep track of. But our information age makes that tracking of pollution and the pricing of harms and the passing out of pollution bills really not a very difficult exercise at all. And that, again, if we make people pay for the harm they're causing or stop what they're doing that's causing that problem, that internalizes the externality, makes sure that no one is getting the benefit of putting harms out onto society for free. By the way, this will change some business models dramatically because there are some companies that couldn't survive except for the fact they are privatizing the gains of their activities, the products they sell, but externalizing the costs, putting at least in part those burdens, whether in the form of pollution or something else, onto the community, onto the society more generally. So I am arguing that we need a new environmental protection agency, not spending its time with engineers figuring out what the best available technology is, and that's the core of our current law, and ordering various industries to apply a certain smokestack scrubber or other piece of pollution control equipment onto their factory activity, but rather to have an EPA focused on measuring harm, putting a price on it by calculating how much risk and epidemiological or ecological harm is being caused, and then sending out the bills, making people pay for what they're doing. I think that kind of a structure creates, again, a big incentive to control pollution. So every factory would have a big incentive to reduce its harm, but also to entrepreneurs and innovators to provide new approaches to doing all the things we need to do that will be much lower emissions. They will be the ones to bring to the factories ways to cut their harm and therefore cut their pollution bills. So I think what it does is it incentivizes innovation and drives people to become solutions providers. Now, again, as I said, this connects in a number of ways to some of the other essays that are in this book. Ken Gillingham, my colleague in the Environment School, one of the rising star young environmental economists, also makes a big argument around the importance of innovation. So I'm excited that his essay lines up so nicely with my own. And of course, as I mentioned, Bill Nordhaus, the same thing. He's making an argument around the importance of a policy framework that puts a price on causing harm. And his central focus, as I mentioned, is on a carbon charge, making people pay for the greenhouse gas emissions that are contributing to climate change. But there are a lot of other ideas that I want to just mention. And I guess I want to pause and say that both the Ken Gillingham idea and the Bill Nordhaus idea are aimed not only at changing the behavior of the polluter, but also inspiring others to help polluters stop polluting. So it's really about not just incentivizing more care with the production activities of society, but also to spur innovation and investment in energy efficiency, in clean energy technology, in renewable power generation. So again, if that is what can be done without paying a price, there will be a relative price signal to steer people away from fossil fuel burning towards these new, cleaner, more renewable technologies. Another source of green lights can be information. So another part of the 21st century sustainability strategy that I want to sketch out for you is how we use data and information and the capacity to get our hands on that information, manage it, and make it actionable with information technology in ways that were unimaginable a couple of decades ago. And in our Better Planet book are several essays that talk about how to do this in one way or another. One of the areas that I've been working on through the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance, which I co-direct with my School of Management colleague, Todd Court, is centered on better metrics of corporate sustainability performance. So asking companies to give us more data on their environmental, social, and governance performance in the marketplace. And that is talked about in the investment world by its acronym ESG reporting. And right now, some companies report, but the data is not very good. A lot of it's backward-looking, not forward-looking. A lot of it's narrowly focused on risk and not always focused on who's a solutions provider, therefore upside opportunities, as well as kind of the downside burdens a company is causing. A lot of it is very focused on reputation rather than operational success. So there's a lot of problems with that existing framework. So Todd and I have been arguing, and his essay in the Better Planet book makes clear that we would benefit as a society from better metrics, better data on corporate performance, really trying to understand who the corporate sustainability leaders are and hold them up as a place that investors might want to go. And what we have found is that an ever larger number of investors are sustainability minded. They want better alignment between their values and where their portfolios are putting their money. So this idea of better ESG metrics is very much what they need to make this desire for an alignment between their values and their portfolio come together. So I think that's a great example of where better data, investment in information, and in this case specifically in a next generation of ESG metrics is going to be essential. Now, of course, some of it still will be risk oriented. And from a climate change point of view, knowing which companies are, as we now say, carbon exposed, likely to be suffering more consequences than their competitors or those companies that are in other industries will be of real value. And in particular, companies holding fossil fuel assets may find themselves with what are known as stranded assets, oil in the ground, natural gas underground that can't ever be taken advantage of because it has become disfavored as we move to a clean energy future. But the next generation of metrics that I want to see goes even beyond those kind of core elements to things like which companies and which industries and which management teams of those companies are positioned to transition to a decarbonized future. Because that's what people would really like to know in the marketplace. Looking out ahead 10 or 15 or 20 years, who's positioned to be a success in business and whose business model may fail because it's trapped in the fossil fuel past. Now, I think that whole idea of a different approach for business, of really trying to understand who the leaders are from a sustainability perspective, dovetails with another of the essays that I very much like, the one by Carter Roberts, who's the head of the World Wildlife Fund. And he has written about kind of the need for a new business ethos. And that actually is capturing a spirit of the moment. Suddenly, there's a lot of talk that the old business mission of thinking that the goal is always to maximize profits or to deliver what the famous University of Chicago economist once called shareholder primacy is giving way to a new business spirit that focuses on stakeholder responsibility. And that means that a business is not just delivering goods and profits for its shareholders, its owners, but has some responsibility to its employees, to the communities it operates in, to its customers, to its suppliers. And I think that argument very much is what Carter Roberts is saying in his essay in this Better Planet book. And I believe that there is a societal value change underway that is basically saying to the business community, you need to be more broad-minded. It can't simply be all about profits, and certainly not about profits where you are privatizing gains and socializing, putting on all of us the costs of things like your pollution. So better information makes that possible. We've got a new capacity with data and information technology to track who's putting those emissions out. And again, in my reimagined world, making those people pay for the harms they're causing. Now, it is also the case that with better data and tracking, we can manage a whole set of other sustainability or environmental problems better. And another of the essays that in the Better Planet book I find really inspiring in its nod to where the future might go is the one by my environment school colleague, Marion Certo, on waste management. And Marion, some of you may know, has been in that arena for something like 30 years and has really been on the front lines of thinking about how we do recapture and recycling of materials and how we try to minimize waste. And that's a booming issue of societal concern, obviously around things like plastic, but even more broadly. And so Marion lays out with one of her students a beautiful argument for a price-based strategy of waste management, where you make people pay for what they throw away, but allow them to recycle for free. And she's got a well-structured essay on how it is we might reimagine waste management to really ensure that we get to a more closed loop use of materials, where that which can be taken back, recaptured and reused will be, and where we're minimizing that which goes out forever as waste. Likewise, there's a great essay in the book from Tracy Meehan. And by the way, one of the notable things about this book is these are not essays from environmentalists. They're from environmental analysts, so people who are really expert in their fields. And it seeks very much to have perspectives that are not all on the left side of the political spectrum, but include a number of Republicans, one of whom is Tracy Meehan, and has written an excellent essay on water management, basically making the argument we can't afford to have such a thing as wastewater. We need to be able to recapture, clean, and reuse all of our water supplies. Absolutely correct. This is true in general, even more true in a world where climate change is going to stress traditional water flows, traditional rainfall patterns. And of course, we're seeing even in Connecticut this year, the emergence of a serious drought. So a great essay on water as a scarce resource, needing to have a price on it to incentivize care and conservation in its management, and to encourage investments in the sort of infrastructure that allows us to be much more tight in our water systems, not lose water. Now, it also is the case that we recognize that some of the problems of the past are a function of people not thinking about ecological linkages. And Schmitz has a great essay on the need to understand ecosystems in a more holistic way, understand the connections across different aspects of the plant and animal world. And I think this provides a very important science foundation for this 21st century approach to environmental protection I'm imagining. And just adjacent to that argument that Oz Schmitz presents is another essay from authors that have their homes in the School of the Environment, Paul Anastas and Julie Zimmerman, who make the case for a systems perspective in environmental law and policy. An integrated approach, not a siloed approach, arguing that the 20th century was often about managing air and water and waste and land in separate legal structures and separate incentive frameworks. And it hasn't worked out that well. We've misunderstood the connections, and in some cases just moved pollution from one form to another. Most famously, if you put a scrubber on a smokestack and it pulls the soot out of the stack, now you have a solid waste. And you put it in the land, now you have a land waste. And then when rainwater comes through it, it takes it into a stream, and now you've turned it into a water problem. So that's not a very good approach. And that's the kind of thing that Paul Anastas and Julie Zimmerman are calling out with their essay aimed at systems thinking, systems design, and really a much more holistic approach to how we produce things, what kinds of products we produce, and our framework of law and policy in response. Similarly, Jane Lubchenco, who's written a beautiful essay on oceans, tells us that we need to get beyond our past framework that the ocean was too big and it wouldn't ever be polluted by us. We couldn't affect it because it was so vast, to the more recent view that the ocean is doomed, that it's full of plastic and hopeless, to her argument that the ocean is central, fundamental to life on Earth, and is too big not to fix. So that is, I think, a beautiful perspective. But her secondary argument is that we have to understand that we have people in our ecosystems. People affect the ocean, and we needed to manage the ocean and the people that live on the planet in a more integrated way, understanding trade-offs and recognizing the need for the ocean to work as an ecosystem, but also for people. And again, it's a systems perspective played out in one particular venue. A fabulous essay from Sue Biniaz, who was for many years on the State Department's climate change team, the lead environmental lawyer in the State Department. She has a similar argument when it comes to climate change, that you can't rely on the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015 to do all the work we need to do. We've got to bring others whose behavior, whose incentive structure shapes choices that determine whether we have a lot of greenhouse gases or not. So she would argue in the international domain, yes, we have a framework convention on climate change with a staff that works on it, but we need to pull in the World Trade Organization and the World Bank and the International Labor Organization, all to be part of a unified effort to respond to the sustainability challenge broadly, to climate change in particular. Another area where I think we've got work to do is on investment. As I mentioned, one of the critical shortfalls of the 20th century was not paying attention where the money would come from to create a sustainable future, to invest in the infrastructure that we would need, clean energy infrastructure and more. Larry Seltzer, who runs the Conservation Fund, another environmental group, makes a very interesting argument that if we are going to get land conservation done at the scale we need, and Tom Lovejoy, in yet another essay, tells us that biodiversity requires us to be much more protective of a much wider swath of land. Well, Larry Seltzer's piece of the story is to say, governments will never do enough. We need to make sure that there is private capital being deployed to be part of our land conservation effort. And he talks about land trusts and other ways of bringing private funds into our land conservation agenda, and really effectively a new model for how we're going to do the scale of habitat protection required for a thriving human population as well as plant and animal life. Another of the essays that I think is really interesting, or several of the essays, relate to the need for new approaches to communications. Tony Lacerowitz in particular, from our Yale Climate Change Communications Project, lays out a very interesting set of views about how Americans see the problem of climate change, what motivates them to take action, even what words resonate with people. And I think understanding how to communicate science to the policy arena is, again, a terrible breakdown of the past and something we need to get much better about going forward into the future. And that brings me to one final essay that I just want to mention. And in a book with 40 essays that I'm the editor of, I'm not allowed to have a favorite, just as no parent can have a favorite child. But I do want to say the essay by Thomas Easley has resonated in a very big and broad way. His piece is called Hip Hop Sustainability, and it reflects his reality of being a dean in the School of the Environment, but also as a hip hop artist. And the case he makes is for bringing the discussion around sustainability, and including climate change in particular, to communities that have been left out of the conversation. In his case, the Black community, the inner city community, the world that he talks to in his hip hop music. And his argument is that if you can speak to people in their own terms, in their own way of approaching a problem, they're much more likely to engage. And he is, of course, correct. So his ability to broaden the discussion, bring people into a political dialogue that they didn't know they had an important reason to be part of is, I think, quite stunning. So let me close just by saying a few more visions of the 21st century strategy for a sustainable future that the Better Planet book lays out. We had a very top-down approach to policy in the 20th century. We need to have some top-down priorities and targets set, but with bottom-up implementation, recognizing not all the work will be done by the federal government, some will be done at the state level, some at the local level, and oh, by the way, some will be done at the global level over it all. We do have the opportunity to build on information technologies that weren't available in the past century. We do have enormous potential to bring data and data tracking technologies to bear to give us new tools and new possibilities for how to limit harm, particularly the idea of tracing and tracking emissions and putting a price on those. And frankly, I would argue that the environmental arena is curiously unaffected up till now by the entire revolution of information technology. No other arena of society that I'm aware of has done so little to bring information technology to bear. You know, no baseball team today picks players the way they might have 30 years ago, when a scout would be chewing tobacco and saying, well, that guy has good stuff and this guy doesn't. No, they're data driven. They now measure how hard people hit, how fast they run, how quickly they jump. So it's a data driven world, and that same spirit just hasn't been deeply embedded into the environmental world yet, but there is a potential to do it now. As I said, we're going to need to move away from government mandates as the core of our regulatory framework to government pricing of harms, letting people be flexible in what they choose to do about that, but pay fully for every bit of harm they're causing. And again, a more integrated world where we're thinking in a unified way, an ecological way about problems, recognizing connections and trade-offs, and trying to be more coherent in how we manage that. And as I said, it's a world that needs more innovation. To get to a much cleaner future, we can't rely on the tools of the past, the frameworks of the past, the incentives of the past. We need to move forward. And I do think that the core of the argument should be this new value, foundational value, that takes the right of breathers ever more seriously. So I don't think it's the case that society doesn't care who has the underlying environmental rights. I think we need to lodge with all of us the right to a clean environment, to make environmental justice a more central part of our policy framework. And with that, I would argue we have a new principle that commits to an end of externalities. Every polluter either stops their harm causing or pays fully. So that's a lot to lay on the table. I invite now questions and comments. I'm often asked whether I see a promising path, whether I'm an optimist or whether I think all the shower of bad news makes me a pessimist. And my answer is I am somewhat pessimistic in the short term, but in the long term, I think there's lots of opportunities. And as this book demonstrates, lots of paths forward. So with that, let me stop and invite your questions, your comments, your pushback, and let's have a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Dan, for this wonderful talk. And please feel free to start typing up your questions in the chat. Ty has kindly offered to moderate and help us handle the questions. And if I may use my prerogative as the organizer to ask the first question.
Please.
So Dan, I see that you are optimistic at the policy level in terms of the interventions that can be done and that will be very, very effective. I was just wondering whether you are optimistic in terms of at the individual level, because we are seeing a rampant denialism of science, of climate change. So how do we change people's minds about being more open and sort of accepting of the facts that are unrolling in front of our eyes?
So,
and the connected question is, do you see, young activists like Greta Thunberg actually playing an important role going forward? How do you see the sort of the activism side of that movement as well? Thank you.
So Priya, you've raised one of the most depressing and could be pessimism-inducing aspects of our current moment, which is how many people seem uninterested in science, in data, in rational analysis, in having policy grounded in facts and empirical analysis. So it really, it could be a source of enormous distress. And I am actually distressed by that. I think, however, that the lesson of our COVID-19 moment may well be that if you don't pay attention to all of that, you suffer. And it's not that somebody else suffers, you will suffer, your family will suffer. And there are kind of straightforward ways to put your risk into a much lower category by wearing a mask and social distancing. And the people who are doing that are having a better outcome than people who are not. And of course, there's bad luck people that weren't behaving properly that still get the disease, and risky behavior folks who don't. But over the broad scope of society, I think it's going to appear very clear that the people who are following science, following data, are going to come out better. But I am stunned at our current political moment where so many people still, even if they have faced personal challenges, don't seem to act in their public life, in their political life, with regard to that very straightforward logic. So I think it is worrisome. I do think that we have activists who are starting to sharpen our thinking, and Greta gets great credit for having raised the profile of climate change. Her school strikes, I think, have motivated lots of young people to think this can't be left to the folks who are of my generation, your generation, to solve the problem. We haven't yet gotten there, and the young folks, I think, are willing to be more creative, to try new things. But I do think, and I don't know whether this is put on Greta specifically, but I do think there is also some challenges for the young. And I see this, in many contexts. But there are trade-offs. One of the reasons we still have a pandemic debate on is because it is a terrible thing that people have lost their jobs. So there is an economic counterpoint to the pandemic that is real. And people have suffered really serious life losses because of lost jobs, lost economic security. So I think the fact is that those who care about the environment have to acknowledge that most people also care about their family's economic security, the ability to have a job. So how do you balance jobs and the environment has got to be taken more seriously. And in that regard, Priya, I'm going to end with your question because I think it's the right one. I think the answer is data and science and good analysis. That's how you do balancing. That's how you make trade-offs. And I don't see any other path forward but to dig deeper into the science and have it emerge even more fully and forcefully as the foundation for our decision making.
Thank you very much.
Question, I think, from Mrs. Frankie.
Well, thank you. To follow up with Thomas Easley's thoughts, incidentally, his last name and mine were the same. My maiden name was Easley. So, has any work been done to help with education as far as primary and secondary schools are concerned? I know it is an area where our hope may be if they are educated along the lines that you're proposing.
So I would tell you that almost everyone who's thought long and hard about what it's going to take to get to a sustainable future sees education and frankly, in generational shifts in underlying understanding and values as foundational. And I think this is true in some arenas that we know already and can see the evidence. The world of recycling didn't exist when you and I were young. We had to be retrained, and we're still not always probably as good as the younger folks. I have to admit to occasionally throwing a beer can in the trash and not in the recycling bin. Now, my children just think that's absurd. They would never imagine throwing away a good aluminum can that's ready for repurposing as a new aluminum can. So that's an element of retraining and of education where the young have got it clear in their minds. They don't even have to think about it, where some of us are still slow on the draw. So I do think better environmental education, beginning at the earliest grades, deepening the understanding of science as the foundation is going to be quite fundamental to success on all of this.
Dan, a question from the chat. We have a couple that have piled up.
Sure.
Someone says, thanks for raising the issue of incorporating externalities in our economic analyses. How do you suggest that might occur?
So I think there are several ways to do this. Again, I'm a big believer in bringing a much richer base of data and analytics to environmental policy. So I would like to have people report more fully on their environmental impacts. I think we should require companies to provide metrics that tell us how much in the way of greenhouse gases they're emitting, what kind of harm they're putting out their effluent pipe into the rivers and streams nearby, what they're putting up a smokestack beyond greenhouse gases that might be of societal concern. And with that data, one can begin to put a number on it. That's why I'm saying we need to recast our EPA away from the engineers of the past and toward epidemiologists, ecologists, risk analysts, and economists who will do that work of putting a number on the externalities and then sending out the bills, making people pay for the harm they're causing. And by the way, some people think that sounds quite radical. It's actually not. This has been the core of environmental efforts over 400 years, which basically said, going back to some of the earliest nuisance cases in British law 400 years ago, on which American law builds. The most famous case is called Aldred. And in that case, a pig farmer was told, you can't have your smelly pigs polluting the neighborhood, stinking up the neighborhood. Either get rid of your pigs, stop the harm, or you're going to have to pay your neighbors for the harm you're causing. So this idea of ending externalities, making people pay for their harm, is 400 years old in our Anglo-American legal tradition.
Okay. Many companies are producing ESG goals spontaneously from within the organization, but U.S. fossil fuel companies are singularly refractory to such endeavors. How can they be brought around?
So I actually am not very optimistic about voluntary environmental social governance reporting. I think there's a problem, never mind in the fossil fuel industry, but broadly, that companies tend to report on their own terms and without regard to the need for comparability across the data, one company to the next. So I'm in favor of having our Securities and Exchange Commission establish a core set of sustainability metrics, again, in the environment, social, and governance categories that would be required alongside of financial data as part of quarterly and annually corporate reports, as providing the foundational information that the stock market needs so that people can understand who's in a good position, who's not. And frankly, it should gauge those who are providing solutions to the market so that we can say that's a company that may be a winner over time, as well as those who are causing harms or holding assets that are a problem, holding fossil fuel assets, for example. So I do think a framework, a government structure of sustainability metrics is probably the way to go. And that would, of course, apply first and foremost to the fossil fuel companies, that would then have to tell us what their risks are and whether they're counting on getting at all these fossil fuels they hold for their future success.
Thank you. Another question. There are some consequences to removing fossil fuels. The LWCF just got full funding in the Great American Outdoors Act, but it is funded by royalties from oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. Won't they have less money to pay their royalties going forward?
Yes, and in fact, that might be an argument some might push back on my entire pay for your externalities line of reasoning, because the goal over time is actually not to have people pay, it's to have people stop polluting. And likewise, to the extent that royalties from fossil fuel exploitation are what fund that land and water account, we probably over time have to plan for a day when those numbers begin to dwindle, because the amount of fossil fuels being extracted is going dramatically down.
Okay. Please, could you explain more about the metrics that companies need to have to achieve SDG? For example, B Lab provides some tools, but maybe there are more that can be built in the near future.
So this raises another very good point. And let me just back up in case not everyone's familiar with the SDG reference. But in addition, in 2015, to having the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the UN put forward something called the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 different goals that represent really not just challenges of environment, but many other issues, including ending poverty, ending hunger, moving towards clean energy, providing better public health, all of which are underpinned by metrics. So there's 169 targets that have been set that these goals are meant to drive countries towards addressing over the 15 years to 2030. So I do think there's a lot of work being done on measuring sustainable development goals, and a good number of companies, I would say many companies that are serious about their sustainability strategies, are trying to translate some of those goals into their own corporate reporting framework. So they're putting together a corporate report on some of the goals that they think are most relevant to their own business, their own industry, and putting that information out to the world. It may well be that as part of the government mandated ESG disclosure, ESG reporting that I would like to see, that a core set of those sustainable development goals would be among the things required.
Okay, thank you. Comments here. The call for bottom-up or top-down is still too anthropocentric. This is a recipe for collapse, one of our participants suggests. We need to transcend this vocabulary and these metaphors. He followed up a bit later with this. More data and greater amounts of science are not enough. We need to change the fundamental metaphors our culture is working with. And he mentions the fatal consequences of a misplaced metaphor in the agricultural industry.
So first of all, I do think how you frame things matters. And again, several of the essays in the Better Planet book make that point. Jade Lubchenko's essay on the oceans is all about a new narrative for the oceans. Tony Lyserowicz's work on climate change is all about how you frame the issue in a manner that engages more people and brings them into the conversation, gets them to take the issue more seriously. I think the challenge that the questioner is presenting is that it's very, very difficult to deliver such a radical change of perspectives that people are going beyond their own human interest to really focus as much as maybe we would like them to on biodiversity, on the world of nature as an equally important priority. And you know, my own experience in the policy arena is that it's in fact a failing cause to try to hope that everyone's going to be high-minded and take nature as seriously as human life. So instead, I believe that the best hope is to frame the agenda around how nature supports people, and that we need to protect biodiversity and support the ocean because in part, at least, it is essential for our own human success.
Thank you. Please, could you elaborate more about environmental justice, especially because nowadays there is an increased role of climate litigation in advancing and undermining climate change action?
So I do think at the core of my vision for a 21st century approach to environmental protection is this idea of not permitting any externalities. That is to say, at least no pollution for free. There may be some unavoidable level of harm that's going to be emitted, but it should all be fully paid for at rates that will provide ongoing deterrence and encourage people to continue to move away from harm causing. And I do think more broadly that what is now often talked about as climate justice beyond environmental justice is suggesting that it's unfair to a number of communities to have the risk of climate change rising. And I like to say that climate change is particularly challenging because the vectors of responsibility are even more complicated than with most issues, which is to say greenhouse gas emissions blanket the Earth. So there is a geographic spread of enormous scale. No one country can solve the problem alone, even if the United States entirely counterfactually were to stop all emissions tomorrow. It would only take 15% of the emissions at the global scale out of the system. We'd still have 85% remaining. So it can only be addressed in a collective global approach. And furthermore, from a point of view of climate justice, there is not only a spatial spread that's enormous, but across time, a temporal spread. And a lot of the harm that's being done is to not anyone who's alive today, but our children, our grandchildren, and their children and grandchildren. So there is a profound intergenerational equity dimension here as well. So I do think environmental justice is a big topic along several different lines, including more immediate harm spilled from factories onto adjacent communities, often communities that are disadvantaged, communities of color, and then these various vectors of justice related to the climate change problem. So lots to work through, and much of it's been underattended to in the past kind of environmental discussions and environmental policy frameworks that have been in place.
Okay, I hope I'm not missing the beginning part of this question. Wouldn't this additional layer of sustainability metrics result in another level of corporate governance and middle management?
No, I think the requirement that companies report on the environment is something that most companies of any scale are doing already. They're just not doing it in a coherent, cross-company, cross-industry comparable way. So I think it could in fact be simplifying for companies to have a single reporting framework defined by the government. Right now, there's a dozen different private sector groups out there in the data analytics world trying to collect this data, sending out surveys, pushing companies to respond to their survey. And as a result, there's a scramble within companies to keep up with all these requests. So a single unified government structure would, I think, actually cut the amount of time and effort required and improve the quality and comparability of the data in a way that would benefit maybe not every company, but certainly all the investors who want that framework of comparable, high quality, high integrity data that they can actually trust and would view as a foundation for making investment decisions.
Okay, continued comment from one of the participants. We now need to move beyond the major universities and change public discourse in culture. Other Rhodes scholars have been working on this for a while, and he suggests, I guess you're familiar with them.
So what is the question there?
I guess just the comment about moving beyond the major universities and changing public discourse, maybe more just of a comment.
You know, I think there is obviously a case to have the conversation carried beyond universities, to be taken into the public domain, into the political arena. I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, what's notable about this year's presidential election is the degree to which environment broadly, but climate change in particular, has been part of the debate, much more so in the past. And I do think, again, we can credit some of the younger activists for having driven the agenda and for having ensured that the candidates really in both parties are having to step up and answer questions. And I think that's given the public as clear a signal and as sharply defined a choice on that set of issues as we have seen in any recent election.
Thank you. I think we've covered the questions that have been submitted thus far. I'm just checking for any new ones, but I think that's pretty much it.
Good. Well, it's been a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I thank Priya and the entire team at the Franke Center for the opportunity to be with you today and to have this discussion. And hope some of you will carry it forward in your own way and in your own settings in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you so much, Dan, for speaking and for an absolutely wonderful talk.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I wish you all well as you think about how to advance the sustainability agenda from your own starting points.